For years, the officers in this town operated with absolute impunity. Every single complaint against them, gone without a trace. Every investigation, snuffed out before it could even begin. They ruled the streets with an iron grip, convinced that no one, not a single soul, could ever challenge their authority. That was until they made the mistake of going after Jamal Cross and his business. They walked in expecting the usual: a man too intimidated to resist, another name to add to their long list of victims who wouldn't dare fight back. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Jamal Cross wasn't just a shop owner. He was Delta Force. He had spent years dismantling the most dangerous criminal networks, taking down men who believed they were above the law. He had fought in places where corruption wasn't just an inconvenience, it was the foundation of power. And in those places, the only way to win was to set fire to the system itself. Those officers thought their badges made them untouchable. But they were about to learn that their shields wouldn't protect them from the storm that was coming. Because Jamal Cross, he wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to destroy them. Before we go any further, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. The late afternoon sun stretched across the storefront, casting deep amber hues through the dusty air. Inside, Jamal Cross stood behind the counter of Cross Spirits and Fine Liquor, watching as the last of his regulars filtered in before the evening rush. This wasn't the life he had imagined for himself. Not at first. 10 years ago, his world was built on battlefields. His days consumed by classified missions and nights spent in places where danger lurked in every shadow. The military had sharpened him, given him discipline, purpose, a skill set most people couldn't even comprehend. But war didn't last forever. Now life had slowed down. It was quieter, calmer, but not without its own kind of fight. The liquor store was his, a small but steady business, tucked into a neighborhood that was changing too fast for its own good. Once, this place had been a community, where people looked out for one another. Now it was being sold off piece by piece, swallowed up by real estate developers and backroom deals no one could prove. Jamal had never been the kind of man to roll over and let people take what was his. That part of him, the part that had walked through war zones and returned in one piece, hadn't faded with time. The bell above the door jingled. Mrs. Wilkins, one of his oldest customers, shuffled toward the counter, cradling a small bottle of peach brandy in her hands. "Evening, baby," she greeted him, her warm smile barely creasing the fine lines on her face. "I see you still haven't fixed that flickering light outside. Gonna give somebody a seizure?" Jamal smirked, glancing toward the buzzing fluorescent fixture near the entrance. "I keep meaning to. Just hasn't made it to the top of my list yet." She gave him a knowing look, the kind only grandmothers and seasoned women could master, one that said she didn't believe him for a second. But she let it slide as he bagged up her purchase. The bell rang again. This time the air in the store shifted. Jamal didn't need to turn around to know that trouble had just walked in. Moving slow, deliberate, he placed Mrs. Wilkins' receipt in her bag before lifting his gaze to the two men standing just inside the entrance. Sergeant Cole Bishop, Officer Ethan Grady. They weren't here for liquor. Mrs. Wilkins, blissfully unaware, gathered her bag and patted Jamal's arm gently. "You stay safe now, you hear?" Jamal nodded, offering her a small but reassuring smile. She made her way toward the door, but the officers didn't bother stepping aside. She had to squeeze between them, an unspoken show of power and disrespect. The door jingled shut behind her. Bishop took his time surveying the store, his gaze slow, deliberate, before finally settling on Jamal. He had the look of a man who believed he owned every room he walked into, broad-shouldered, exuding a confidence only men who had never faced real consequences could afford. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming like a trophy. Grady, on the other hand, was younger, the kind of man who had something to prove. Jamal didn't move as Grady strolled toward the shelves, dragging his fingers along the whiskey bottles like a man inspecting his own property. He picked one up, turning it over in his hands with a smirk. Didn't expect a place like this to have real liquor, he muttered. Figured it'd be more of that cheap corner store garbage. The kind y'all like. Jamal didn't respond. Bishop stepped forward, leaning his elbows against the counter like they were old friends. Relax, Cross, he drawled. We're just making our rounds. Checking in on businesses in the neighborhood. City's making some changes, keeping things running smooth. New rules, new expectations. Jamal raised a brow. New rules. Bishop nodded. See, we work hard to keep order in this part of town. Make sure everything stays nice and safe. No trouble. No unnecessary headaches. But, of course, all that takes effort. And effort costs money. Grady made a sound in his throat, shaking his head like he was disappointed. Lot of these places got real lucky getting to stick around at all. Some folks just don't know how to appreciate that. His eyes flickered toward the black-owned business sticker near the register. And then he smirked. Permits are getting real strict these days, Grady continued, his voice dripping with casual menace. Gotta be careful with those health codes. Can't have businesses letting things get too unsanitary. Jamal understood exactly what they were saying. Protection tax. His voice was flat, unreadable as he stated it plainly. Bishop responded with a small, almost amused smile, as if the word itself was some kind of joke. Call it what you want, he said smoothly. But cooperation. That just makes things easier for everybody. Pay a small monthly fee, and we make sure everything runs without a hitch. That liquor license of yours. No sudden issues. Health inspections. Quick and painless. And if, let's say, someone decided to break in here, well, we'd be the first ones on the scene. Wouldn't want anything bad happening, now would we? Jamal's fingers curled slightly against the countertop, but his face remained neutral, betraying nothing. His heartbeat steady. His breathing slow. And if I don't? Bishop let out a slow, measured breath, shaking his head like a disappointed teacher dealing with a stubborn student. Then you take a risk, he said, voice calm, almost sympathetic. Grady chuckled, a low, knowing sound. A big risk, he added, his gaze flickering toward the front door. We had to shut down a couple places last month. Unfortunate paperwork issues. And you know how some neighborhoods get, real unpredictable, especially when the wrong kind of people start hanging around. He let the words settle, then gestured vaguely at the store. A lot of folks ain't cut out for running a business. Place like this. Could be something else by next year. Something cleaner. Classier. Jamal didn't respond. Instead, he let the silence stretch, letting the weight of their words settle between them like thick, unmoving fog. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached for the register, hit the cash drawer shut with a solid click, and folded his arms across his chest. I'll pass. The smirk on Bishop's face faltered just slightly, a crack in the polished exterior. Grady, however, exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head like he had expected this, like Jamal was making things harder than they needed to be. Man's making things difficult for himself, Grady muttered. Bishop straightened his stance, his expression shifting, something calculating flashing behind his eyes. He nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. Grady sighed. Shame, he muttered under his breath. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he let the whiskey bottle he'd been holding slip from his grasp. The glass shattered on impact, exploding against the floor in a burst of sound that cut through the heavy silence like a gunshot. The scent of alcohol filled the air instantly, thick and deliberate, the amber liquid seeping into the cracks between the tiles. Neither officer flinched. Bishop took a slow step backward, adjusting his cuffs as he turned toward the door. You're going to regret that, Cross, he said smoothly. We'll be back. The bell above the door jingled softly as they walked out, the sound too light, too casual, for the threat they had just left behind. Jamal didn't move. His eyes stayed on the dark liquid creeping across the floor, the smell sharp, unmistakable. This wasn't a warning. It was a promise. And the next time they came back they wouldn't be asking. Even after midnight, The hum of distant traffic lingered in the air, the occasional car passing by and casting fleeting beams of light across the sidewalk. But for the most part, the streets were quiet. Too quiet. Jamal pulled the heavy metal shutter down over the storefront, securing it with a thick padlock that had kept his place safe for years. He took a step back, inhaling deeply, letting the night settle around him. Something was off. Not fear. Not paranoia. He knew the difference. This was something heavier. A weight pressing against his ribs, whispering that he should have been more prepared. That this wasn't over. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head at himself. He had spent years in places where instincts were the only thing that kept a man breathing. And those instincts, they had never failed him.